Welcome to the second module of Volunteer Rocket. You know, pastors often hear a plea from the staff member or somebody say, you got to get me some more volunteers in the nursery area. We need some more people out in guest services. And while that may fill the gap for the short term, it doesn't really help in the long term. So the bottom line for this segment is this: you've got to design before you deploy. And so in this video, Casey's going to give you a system for how to gain, train, and retain volunteers. And so watch this and let's get to work.
Welcome to Module 2 of Volunteer Rocket. My name is Casey Graham, one of the founders of the Rocket Company. So excited to be here with you and talk about something that is crucial to volunteerism and is crucial to something that we found in leading volunteer ministries ourselves, being part of a volunteer ministry and actually volunteering in a church, which I have for the last 3 years. And then also studying the church and looking at it. And we've just seen that there's something that's just, it's bubbled up and it's huge. And this builds upon what Michael talked about in section number 1, in module number 1, where he talked about, there's a bunch of people in your church that are there, and they're the priests. They're the priesthood of the believers. And that's a real deal theological look at the people that we're all in ministry. It's not just people that are paid to be in ministry, but if you're a Christian, you're in ministry, and that's where the whole concept of volunteerism came from anyway. And so with that kind of setting us up in the foundation, I'm going to get to some of the practical stuff of what we've found of what it looks like to organize a volunteer system. Because listen, I know the pain of where you've been in organizing a volunteer ministry. Because when I first started out in volunteer ministry, it was just we needed more volunteers. And so we went and got more volunteers and we plugged them in and we hoped they stayed. And we would do that again and again and again. And it took some fallout. It took some people quitting. It took some unhappy volunteers. It took some retention issues, some recruiting issues for us to really find out that, man, we probably need to organize this a little bit better. And so through the pain I've experienced of leading this and through the success of what we've studied in a lot of churches and going and looking at this volunteer thing, we found that there's an answer to the volunteer problem. You think you may have a people problem. You may think people are falling out because they're not committed or they just won't volunteer, or that there's a people problem. But what we found is it's usually a process problem. Is that there's not a process in place to lead people through attracting a new volunteer, bringing them in, getting them connected, training them right, and all of that kind of stuff. And so what we're going to do in this module is I'm going to train you on a system, because in so many ways a system is what we're lacking. And we rely on a sermon and hope the pastor preaches a good message to get enough volunteers to come and work in the children's ministry or student ministry or greeter ministry. But that's just not cutting. It's not working. That's why you're a part of this training. That's what you're looking for. And so this system that we're going to train you in today is going to be practical, step by step. And what we found from all the churches we've studied is a commonality. They have 5 things in common. And if you can take the 5 things that we're going to talk about today and you can apply them to your volunteer ministry, you will gain more volunteers. You'll train them in a way that actually works and it sticks in their life, and it's not just a boring training meeting. And you will retain people, and they will be happy about being a volunteer and tell their friends, hey, I want to volunteer at this church as well. So here's the deal. The bottom line is this: you must design before you deploy. You must design a volunteer ministry before you deploy any volunteers into it. Like the United States Army does not just go out and just recruit people and say, hey, let's just send them to war. No, that's not how it works. They have a step-by-step system in which is designed, which you put people through a process of training, and it's very rigorous and organized. They send people to boot camp first, and after boot camp, they go to a specialized training. After specialized training, they go to the next thing. The reason why they do that is because they've designed a system before they deploy people. And the same thing is true when it comes to church and volunteer ministry. And you've got to create and design a volunteer ministry, not just ask for more volunteers. And if you want to create a system that works and is sustainable, where you can create and double the amount of volunteers that you have and get them double as happy, is you've got to design a system on paper. You've got to design a philosophy through which you move people through and design a step-by-step system. And that's what Volunteer Rocket's going to be about. And so I'm going to teach you this step-by-step system that we found that's bubbled up to say, listen, this may not be the only system, but at least it is a system that we've seen that works, and it's step-by-step. And if you can design your volunteer ministry around these 5 areas and these 5 things, it will work for your church. Now, here's the great part about this. If you can say the letters A, B, C, D, and E, you can understand this volunteer system. Because we've seen that it comes down to A, B, C, D, and E. And you're like, well, what does that mean? Well, I'm going to teach you. And so you can get out your pens, get ready to write this down, take some good notes, because this is what it means to organize a volunteer ministry. So let's jump into the system and let's look at the A, B, C, D, E method to creating a volunteer ministry in your church, okay? So the very first thing is this. I'm going to write on the board. You can check this out. In the volunteer ministry, number one thing you've got to do is attract. Attract. And you say, well, what in the world does attract mean? We have got to attract the right kind of volunteers into our ministry. Now, some people may use the word recruit. Some people may use the word persuade. Some people may use the word guilt. Whatever it is in your church, well, I think we all know that we've got to have a way to attract new people in. Now, we're going to spend the entire next module on how to do that and give you different methods to doing that and all that kind of stuff. But getting the right kind of people in is probably the most important thing that you can do in volunteerism, because the right people, the right leaders will fix the right issues, and they will do the right things in the right roles in the right way. And so getting the right people in is huge. And so attracting people in, that's what A means. And my question for you is this: what's your attraction system? What's your attraction system? Do you have a step-by-step plan for how you attract people into your volunteer areas? Because we found that it comes in many different ways. You don't just have to have it one way. There's many ways you could do this. But do you have a defined way in which you attract people into your volunteer areas? It could be from a sermon where people sign up on a card. It could be from one-on-one shoulder tapping, is what some churches do. It could be from a system in which you do a 101, 201, 301 class system. We've seen all these different ways, but the key point is this, is if you're going to create a volunteer ministry that's sustainable, you've got to have an attraction system that is step-by-step, that's written down on paper, that's agreed upon by your leadership team. This is the way we attract people in to ministry roles and ministry positions. That's A of attract. Now let me tell you the second thing, and this is so hard, I know. From A to B, okay? So here's the B, is build. Build. You have to build up volunteers before you send them into battle. You have to build them up. You got to build up their confidence. You got to build up their knowledge base. You got to build up they got to know who they report to. There's things that they've got to figure out. And so many times in churches is that we attract people and we just throw them into battle. Well, if you just attract people and there's no training that trains them into what they're what to expect, what their expectations are of them, giving them a job profile, saying here's exactly what time we need you to show up, here's how often we need you to be here, here's the calendar for the year of what we're going to expect from you and all of that kind of stuff. If they don't know that stuff, this is where the first step in which we find volunteers become very unsatisfied and very unhappy. The other side of this is that we know that so many churches, they'll attract volunteers and then they put them in boring volunteer training meetings that are just terrible. Listen, I've been a volunteer for the last 3 years. I've sat through some meetings. My church does a really good job, but I've also sat through some informational meetings and stuff that I'm like, you could have just sent an email or you could have sent this out. Like, why in the world am I sitting here for an hour? And here's the reality. Building a training system for your volunteers where you can build them up, build their confidence, build their knowledge base, build their experience base of what they can expect. This will create a sustainable ministry in which you can attract volunteers and then immediately move them into a training system which is going to get them ready for volunteering in your church, whether they're a coach, whether they're a leader of leaders, or whether they're just a volunteer, a greeter, whether they're running the coffee ministry, they're in the baby room, or wherever they are. You've got to have the B in place, because building people up is what will keep them in it for the long haul. The third thing is this: connect. Connect. We have A, you got to attract them in. B, you build them up. You got to train them right. And then C, you've got to connect them. And what we're going to look at in connection is something that Bill Hybels says. Bill Hybels says a new volunteer is a fragile volunteer. And they do a great job at Willow Creek Church with volunteers. And they found out something, that the first 30 days is very fragile when it comes to volunteerism. Because if we just take people and we attract them in and we just throw them into ministry and we have no way to onboard them or connect them to the right people, they're not going to make it. Or it's going to be luck if they do make it. And so we found that churches that do a really good job at creating a sustainable volunteer ministry is they create a connection system. So for somebody's first 30 days, here's my question for you. Do you have a step-by-step checklist through which you take people through that gives them exactly who they're going to report to, who's going to be on their team and connecting them to their team, and exactly what their expectations are of who they're going to be serving? And if you don't have that, that's what connection is about, is that you attract them, you get them in, you recruit them, whatever, you train them up, you build them up, and then you spend the first 30 days being super hands-on with them so that you can be hands-off because they were connected well. And we find so many churches that this is where a big fallout happens, and this is where volunteers just go, man, I don't even know what to do. I signed up, and now I show up, and I'm supposed to greet at the door, but nobody helped me do this. And it's just me and this guy, and I don't know what to do. And that's where a lot of the weirdness and a lot of the things come in. It's just like, I don't know if this fits. So this connection piece is very fragile, and this is a great thing. And so we're going to teach you a whole module on that, but you got to connect people well, because if you connect them well, and you connect them well with who they report to, who they connect with, and who they're going to be serving every single week, and if you connect them well and you create a good on-ramp, they will stay longer and they will be happier volunteers than just throwing them to the fire and throwing them to the wolves and just hope that it all works out. So that's the third thing. The fourth thing is this: develop. Develop. This one is, as we've gotten into it, we've started seeing a lot of churches, they attract people just out of need. Some churches build people up through training. Very few churches connect volunteers well. We found that churches are very, very much struggling with developing volunteers over the long haul. Because developing a volunteer and creating systems where they're cared for, they're communicated with, they're supported, they're loved on, where they don't feel burnout, where they can get time off, where they have other people that are checking in with their lives, not just checking in with what time they're going to show up, and actually creating inspirational stuff that they want to attend and come to, not just informational meetings where they come and show up and go, well, this is a waste of time. This one is a huge piece of lowering the burnout and the fallout rate in your ministry. And so we're going to teach you about developing an ongoing system. And this is what we've learned from being a part of them. Listen, I go to these meetings. And so I've learned some of the things of things that work well and some that don't work well. I've put on bad meetings before, and we've put on good meetings before. I've been to them, put them on, all in between. And so we're going to take from our set of experiences and from what we've learned and train for how do you keep people developing them? Because here's what we know. Your next leader should be coming from the volunteer area in which they're already serving. And if you have a good development system, this is where you will multiply your ministry, because people will say, I want to do more, I want to be a higher level, and I want to grow in my leadership. That's what development looks like, an ongoing system. And the churches that do it best, they have a systematic, written down way to develop people. Here's my question for you. Do you have a development system for your volunteers that's agreed upon by your leadership team? That's step by step, that says, here's how we develop leaders, here's how we take care of leaders, here's how we communicate with leaders, here's what we do for our existing coaches, leaders of leaders, volunteers, people in the baby room, people in the parking lot, everywhere in between. Do you have a care system for them? Do you develop them? And that's what this module is going to be all about. And that's what we found in churches that do really well, is they keep people for a long time, is they develop people well, because it's about people. It's not just about getting a role filled. That's why this matters so much. So that's A, attract people in. B, build them up. C, connect them. You want to do a connection. D, you've got to have an ongoing support system to keep them year after year after year without burning them out. And the last thing is this, is E, is evaluate. 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 You've got to evaluate your ministry. And you say, what does evaluate mean? Well, here's what it means. You've got to look at the facts, not just depend on your feelings. Look at the facts. Don't just depend on your feelings. And what do I mean by this? churches, in a lot of ways, we lean on our feelings a lot of times when it comes to things and say, we feel like we have a good volunteer ministry. We feel like people are inspired. Man, did you hear that story of the guy who said he loved serving? Well, just because one person says something to us or just because we feel like something is working, it does not mean that it's true. And where we learn this from is Jim Collins, who wrote many great books. But in his book, Good to Great, he talks about confronting the brutal facts. And I know for our organization, and even for me personally, sometimes to look at the brutal facts, whether it's looking at a personal budget and you look at your money on paper, whether it's looking at the numbers of how many people are showing up in your church, whatever the facts are, and looking at them consistently, that will help you evaluate what's really going on. And so what this is evaluating the facts. And so do you have a metric system of numbers where you look at quantitatively, where you say, this is how many people are volunteering in our church? How many people? Well, we studied a church of the Highlands of Birmingham. They say, and this is what they know, that 1/3 of their attendance volunteers in ministry. Well, they know that because they evaluate their effectiveness in being a great church that does a great thing with their dream team volunteers, is what they call them. Well, they know that because they're evaluating and they have numbers associated to their feelings. And so developing out a full volunteer ministry is not just about getting some people there and hoping everything works out, but it's really looking at the facts and going, how many people are showing up? And then how many people are showing up that are actually volunteers? Like, just because they signed up, just because they raised their hand, I know I've been around church leaders so long that we're notorious, and I'm the same way in so many ways. We're notorious because we had 200 people say, yes, I want to volunteer. We think we have 200 volunteers. No. We've got to take it all the way down to literally how many people are showing up. So here's my question. Do you have a system that shows you how often people are showing up to volunteer in your church? Do you know the numbers of exactly how many people are connected into ministry, into your church, into a volunteer area? And so what evaluation is looking at the facts, looking at the figures and going, we're winning or we're not winning based upon goals and numbers and standards in which we've set to be successful. And that's what evaluating means. And so when you look at this whole thing together, you have attract. And so what you can start to see is all these things linked. So you attract people in. You build them up through training. You build their knowledge base. You build their confidence. You build their experiences and expectations. After you build them, you connect them. You have a 30-day plan that puts them on the same page, that who they're going to report to, who they're going to be in volunteer ministry with, who they're going to serve every single week. From connection, then you have a plan where you put them in ongoing development. How do you keep them year after year after year? And then after you have a development plan, consistently evaluating through the numbers and through the metrics, you decide this is how many people we want to have in volunteerism. This is the goals we want to have. And that's where we're going to start. This, my friends, is a volunteer system. And this never ends. This is the job of the person who runs a church. This is the job of the senior pastor, if you're watching this, to employ people on our staff and on our teams and volunteer leaders to train, to understand that our jobs are to attract, build, connect, develop, evaluate. Because when we build a volunteer system, we will create many more volunteers. We will create happier volunteers. We will create inspirational meetings that people actually want to attend. We will develop people in a way that they'll want to stay for years. And the system will work for you instead of you getting your lunch eaten by just thinking, I need to have more volunteers. And so this is the system which we found. Again, this isn't a perfect system. This isn't one that every church in America does, but this is the one that we've seen that the best churches, that they do these things and they do them absolutely well. So that's the overall look at the system. But let me drill this down for you and give you some just practical handlebars for you to take this. You'll have the document of this chart where you can print it out and you can look at it. Here's some questions that you can ask that will help you start to understand this system in your church. Here's the first thing you got to do. The first thing you should do is grade yourself and get your team. If you've got a team, even if you're a bivocational pastor watching this, you can get people in your church that help you out in volunteer areas. Or if you have a staff, you've got a full staff of people, get some people on your staff. And here's what you want to do. You want to get around, you want to print this out, and you want to explain to them, or let me explain in this video to them, what each one of these means. And then give it a grade, A, B, C, D, or F. And you come through and you go, well, man, we're a C in attracting new volunteers, or building, training volunteers, we're at A+. Man, this is where we do the best job. We have the best training system. Connecting people, man, we may be an F here or whatever. And you go around and you just place a grade on where you are. And what we found is that just by looking at it and putting a grade there, it can show you here's where we're doing well and here's where we need to improve when it comes to this. The next thing is that you got to ask this question. What are you good at? When it comes to attracting volunteers, building people up through training, connecting people in the first 30 days, ongoing development and pastoring of people, or evaluating numbers, you watching this video, where would you place yourself to say, I'm an A+ in this area? Because what we found is that most leaders will tend to go one way or the other. For me, when I was in volunteer ministry, here's where I spent my time. I was an A+ at attracting volunteers. I spent my time recruiting, going to Starbucks, meeting with people, getting new people in. That's what I did. That's what I loved. I loved doing that. And I also loved connecting and making that connection with people. But when it came to doing training meetings, I didn't even feel bad about this. I just didn't like it. I wasn't good at it. I wasn't good at going through the details. I hated it. I wanted to spend time on the relationships. And so we had to have other people that were engaged in helping in these areas. And so that brings me to the third point when it comes to this chart. Not only do you have to grade yourself as a church, not only do you have to figure out what you're the best at, you've got to understand this, is that, and ask this question, who wakes up every single day and thinks about A, B, C, D, or E in your church? Who wakes up thinking about it in your volunteer areas? Because if you are a student pastor and you're watching this, who's waking up thinking about who's going to attract? Who's waking up thinking about who's going to build up those volunteers, train, all that kind of stuff? You've got to have somebody waking up that thinks about this. And what I've found is that one person cannot think of more than about 2 of these areas and do them effectively. And so you've got to build a team, a leadership team of people that will help you think through this. And I know in so many ways this is revolutionary to maybe your thinking, and maybe you've been doing everything yourself. But that's the beauty of being a part of Volunteer Rocket. Through these modules, we're going to train you on how to attract. And you can literally use our module on attraction. And if you're not good at attracting, you can give it to somebody in your church and say, watch this. This is how we're going to attract volunteers, and I need you to help me. Whatever it is that you don't want to do, we can help train them for you. But you've got to have somebody that wakes up in the morning that thinks about each one of these things. So a practical example of when I was using this model at church is that literally there was a lady that she was a behind-the-scenes person. She did not want to be out front. She did not want to volunteer with people. She was a complete introvert. But what I saw is like, she loved spreadsheets. She worked at a bank and she worked behind the scenes. And what she did is that, and I'm terrible at this, but she loved it, was she loved to evaluate numbers. And so I knew I was good at attracting volunteers and connecting, and I knew that I had somebody on my team that helped build. I had another person that was a volunteer that did our ongoing development and made sure that we stayed in touch with volunteers. But she loved to evaluate. And literally what she did is every week she just said, here's how many people showed up for volunteerism. We had sign-in sheets. People knew exactly how many showed up. And we knew all the time where we were when it came to evaluating the numbers, if we were being successful or not. That's what I mean by having people engaged and involved. And so that's the system, A, B, C, D, and E. And if you, as the leader, can get many people involved in this, whatever volunteer area you're in charge of, you can do an absolute great job at building a sustainable volunteer ministry that people love to be a part of. That's how a volunteer ministry works in the church. I'm going to talk about how this should work in your church. And let's move from principle to practical and get right down to what you need to do before you watch the next module, because this is going to set up the rest of the modules, the rest of the 5 modules that you're going to watch. This is what's going to set this up and make it successful for your church. So I'm going to take a ministry, just about every church has, and you can apply this to whatever ministry you're a part of, but here's what you've got to do. You've got to create a volunteer org chart. That's a volunteer organizational chart that literally draws out all of the different volunteer roles that you have inside of the area that you're above. So let's just take a ministry that a lot of churches have, which is children's ministry. So this is children's ministry. And most churches have a children's ministry person that's over the area, okay? So we're going to call this the children's ministry director. And you may not have that person. And this is the first step, is that you realize that you've got to have a children's ministry director. But having a children's ministry director, that's somebody that's over the children's ministry, okay? Then what you got to do is break it out and go, most children's ministries, they have two areas. One is they have pre-K. So they've got kids before kindergarten, or if they have babies. I've got one in that area right now. It's before kindergarten, okay? And then you've got after kindergarten or elementary. So we'll just call this elementary age kids. And so you've got pre-K and you've got elementary age kids. Now, what I'm doing here is not just writing the different ministries you need. These are actually representation of people. And so as you're building out this, what you're going to see is that, man, I may not have somebody, I've just got a children's ministry person that's over all of these areas. Well, this is the first step in multiplying your leadership and multiplying yourself as a leader. Because when you write this stuff out, you'll go, well, man, there's pre-K. Well, this is a person. So this might be the preschool director. And you would write that out, a preschool director. This would be an elementary age director. And you would write elementary age director out. And you see that right now you may go, wow, I don't have that. And if you're doing a greeter ministry, or you're doing an usher ministry, if you're doing a production ministry, whatever it is, this is why this is practical and will multiply your leadership. Because as you write things out, you will see roles develop and go, I have these holes that can multiply your leadership, so you don't have to do all of the work. You can multiply yourself through volunteers. So let's go with the preschool. Inside the preschool, we may go that there is 2 rooms. We'll keep it simple. There's room 1 and there's room 2. Well, room 1 and room 2, a lot of churches, what they would do is just go, there's room 1 and room 2, we need some workers. Well, what we've seen churches that do the best at is they would go, there's room 1 and room 2 is what we need as a leader. We need a room leader. So we've got room 1 and they're a leader. So what that means is they're a leader over this room, and they are in charge of room number 1. Room 2, you have a leader. So you have people. So you see us building out this organizational chart. Now, we're just doing this on paper first, and you may say, we don't have these people. Well, what we found is when you write it on paper, the people actually are attracted and they will come and they will fill the holes. But until you write this out, you will not have the people show up. And so let's keep going. So room 1, you may have 2 workers that you need in room number 1. So worker 1 and worker 2. And they can be called volunteers, servants, dream team, baby worker, whatever you want to call them, they can be called. But we're just saying this is a person that works in here and they work. So there's 2 roles that are going to be fulfilled. So inside this room, every Sunday morning at the 9 o'clock hour, we've got to have worker number 1, worker number 2. We've got a room leader. We've got a preschool director that they report to. And then there's a children's ministry director all above them. Now you may be going, well, my church only has 50 people. It does not matter. If you want to grow your church, if you want to grow your ministry, if you want to grow your leadership, create a model of volunteer that's double your size, that's double the size of what you currently are. And if you write it out on paper of what you're going to need, the roles that you're going to fulfill, the people will be attracted, and then you will know what success is. And then you can literally come in and start writing people's names on this. And so what you do is you just come through and create, for whatever ministry you're above, a volunteer org chart like this that has roles and responsibilities. And this is the first thing you've got to do before you watch the next ministry. Before you watch the next module. And when you watch the next module, you'll start to see that this is where you're going to be. When you're attracting volunteers, you're not just going to be attracting volunteers into, well, come be a volunteer. You're going to know, I need a worker in room number 1. You be very specific, because guess what? One of the best ways to attract volunteers is be specific about what you need. So then you're not just going, hey, we need some volunteer workers in the children's ministry. What you can say is, we need a preschool director, somebody you don't even have to work with the kids. You'll be over all the adults and you'll never be in a classroom where you work with the kids. Different people will be attracted to that role. This is how you build out your volunteer ministry, and this is the first place you got to start, is build the organizational chart, and do this before you watch the next video. But there's the second point that flows up out of this. And here's the deal, is that you've got to, when you start to look at this, I know something that may be coming to your mind is like, well, what do you mean with all these people reporting to all these people, and my church isn't built like this? Well, you got to decide what your leadership structure is going to be. Because in most churches, what I've found, a lot of churches, here's what it looks like. it looks like this. It looks like, here's the pastor or director or whatever, and they have all the volunteers that report to them. And this is what it looks like. So on Saturday, you're getting the phone calls that so-and-so can't show up, and they're calling the pastor, they're calling the director, they're calling the person who's paid to work at the church. And you got all the problems and all the stuff and all the communication. If you have this model where I'm the ministry director, I'm the pastor, and I'm over all the volunteers, they all report to me, you cannot grow beyond the leadership capacity that you're currently at. You've got to decide on a leadership structure that will allow you to grow your leadership and move to the next level. And that's where it comes into a couple of different structures that you can pick from. One of the structures that I know I've used in the past is where we've simply decided that everybody's not just a volunteer. That some people are leaders of volunteers. And then you have people, adults, that lead teams of volunteers. And what we found is when you have something like that, and we call them coaches, those coaches would care for that area specifically. They would care for that class. They would care for that division. They would care for that area. And when you have that, it works great. Another church that we studied, the whole ABCDE model, where you attract, build, connect, develop, and evaluate, that every single volunteer area has that model and a person over that model that are in that area. And so you would write it out and you would go, hey, we've got the pastor here that's over it, or ministry leader, director, and then we have somebody that's over A, and that's going to be John. And we would write John's over A for the children's ministry. B, and you would put B, and you would put Betty is over B, and she builds and she does the training for this area. And you can build it out that way. So it doesn't matter to us how you pick your leadership structure, but what matters is that you have one and it's defined, and you say, this is how we're going to lead our volunteer ministry area, because that will determine how you build your organizational chart out. So before you watch the next video, you got to write that org chart out, and you got to define what your volunteer organizational structure is going to look like. And when you do that, you're going to be well on your way to multiplying yourself, multiplying your ministry, and taking it to a whole nother level. So before you watch the next module, your homework is very simply is to write an organizational chart on paper, on a board, somewhere, because when you write it down, you will win. So go ahead, get the paper out, schedule the meeting, start now, write that organizational chart out, and we'll see you in module number 3.